Welcome to a special episode of Short Circuit. What is freedom? I grew up in the Soviet Union, and to stop myself from going crazy, I adopted a rather minimal definition of this word. Like Orwell's Julia, I believed that even in a totalitarian society, I could still be free as long as I had the privacy of my own thoughts. They can make you say anything, says Julia to Winston in 1984. But they can't make you believe it. They can't get inside you. They can't get to your heart. Those were the words I lived by. Until I started following the scholarship of our guest, a professor of law and philosophy at Duke University, Nita Farahany, who for over a decade has been writing about neurotechnology and how the contents of our minds can be exploited through this technology by governments and corporations alike. Her latest book is The Battle for Your Brain, Defending the Right to Think Freely in the Age of Neurotechnology. Nita Farahany is with us today to discuss the book and also what public interest lawyers can do to defend against the Orwellian future that's no longer science fiction. Welcome, Professor Farahany.
Thank you. That was quite an introduction. It makes me now think, wait, I've unmoored you from your principles in life. That's not good. Hopefully I'll bring you back around by the end.
I look forward to it. I very much look forward to it. Well, let's start with the basics for our listeners. So could you tell us what is it that the technology can do when it has access to our brains, and how can it do it?
Yeah, so to get there, we've got to back up a tiny bit, which is, so for the most part, when people hear neurotechnology, all they think of these days is something like Elon Musk and implanted neurotechnology, like a chip in your head. And that's not really what we're going to talk about today. We can go there to some extent if you want, but that's like a highly regulated, very narrow industry that's primarily going through safety and efficacy testing. What we're going to talk about more today is the coming age of widespread wearable neurotechnology and neural interface technology. So what do I mean by that? Do you have like a smartwatch or something that you wear, or a smart ring that you wear?
Yes.
All right.
And my husband does too. And everybody I know at IJ does as well.
Yeah. So I'm dumb in my technology, but maybe just because, you grew up in the Soviet Union, my parents are from Iran. I grew up like deeply suspicious of the way in which data is used for surveillance purposes, right? So even though I am very fond of Apple as a company, I generally just am like, okay, if you don't need my data, I'm going to try to limit that data. But people are increasingly wearing these devices that have sensors that track their bodily activity and can be used to make inferences about their heart rate or other types of metrics about their body. And what's already hit the market and starting to become much more widespread, and soon will become much, much more widespread as the big tech companies launch their products, is embedding brain sensors into earbuds and headphones and watches that pick up the electrical activity in your brain as, if it's at the wrist, it's picking up brain activity as it goes from your brain down your arm to your wrist, and picks up your intention to swipe or type or move in virtual reality. If it's embedded in your earbuds or in your headphones, it's picking up electrical activity that comes through your skull, right, and through the scalp, and is picking up, the average of neurons firing in your brain, which, thanks to advances in AI, can increasingly be decoded to tell a lot about what's happening in your brain. And what's really kind of revolutionary about this shift that's coming is that it's not just like the sensors that you might have in your watch or in your ring that pick up basic health metrics. It also has the power to replace your keyboard and your mouse, and eventually like your joystick and your controller, because it's neural interface. That is, you're interacting with other technology by thinking about doing so instead of using your traditional peripheral devices. And so to answer, that's a long answer to your question, is this is what's coming, and then what can it actually reveal? And we can, get into some of that. The broadest is that it reveals brain states, like, are you paying attention, or is your mind wandering? Are you fatigued? Are you happy or sad? But increasingly, thanks to these advances in AI, and especially generative AI, It's increasingly possible to tell, a face that a person is looking at, a story that they're imagining, simple words, shapes, or numbers that are in their mind, to decode not just like these basic brain states, but more substantive content, or to probe a person and say, like, here's, in the criminal justice system, here's a crime scene. Do you recognize that crime scene? And then see what your brain reveals. So we can get into the specifics and the details,
Yes.
but it's getting increasingly more specific for what can be decoded based on that brain activity.
And how, just kind of the most basic level, how is it just possible for technology, for like an EEG device or something like that, to be able to actually decode that?
Yeah. So the EEG can't do it alone, right? It can just pick up the signals. And it's a pretty noisy signal. So I'll say that, which is like one of the big challenges for a lot of the companies that are launching brain sensors, EEG sensors into an AirPod is, you move and you sweat. And like if you're running and the contact with your skin moves around, all of those muscle contractions and movements have brain activity that's associated with it as well. And the EEG can pick up all of that as well. So first, one of the big advances that's been happening is that the sensors have gotten better, but more powerfully, the algorithms have gotten better to filter out the difference between that's a muscle contraction, that's an eye blink, that's a movement, and that's brain activity that's associated with, like a mental state or some substantive content. And the more training data there is, the better those have gotten. What generative AI enables that's really revolutionary is the co-evolution of the technology with the individual. And so, right out of the box, one of these devices might do something simple like enable you to think up, down, left, right. But then as the generative AI model that's on device learns, like, this is what your brain activity looks like when you're trying to send a text message, and here's what the content of that text message is, it becomes increasingly more sophisticated so that you have essentially a large language model that is trained on your brain activity and then can increasingly and more specifically decode your brain activity. And really like cutting edge research that's coming out shows that it's possible then to have an algorithm that translates what has been trained on your brain activity to then be used to decode somebody else's brain activity with just some very basic calibration across individuals. And so it's not like you have your own private large language model that nobody else has access to. It becomes a scalable model that can decode a lot of other people's brain activity.
Yeah, but it is also can be like one of the examples in the book you use is that there can be an identity recognition through your personal reaction to a song, for example. And it's even better than our thumbs or our facial recognition, because the way we react to a song is only the way, like what my personal associations are with that song. Yeah.
So, biometric identity has been a huge area of growth, particularly for identification, right? So biometric, whether it's iris scans or gait analysis or any other different metric of the body. And biometrics are great in that they can be more unique to identify individuals, but they also have unique risks associated with them as well, because it's much harder to change, static biometrics. So a functional biometric becomes a better and more secure form of biometrics. By functional, what I mean is instead of like taking a face print that's static, if you sing a little song in your head and the unique pattern of you singing that song in your head is something that's recorded, that becomes like the way you sing that song in your head. Like if we were just to come up with a little verse right now and I'd say like sing, Taylor Swift's newest song in your brain. If you sing it and I sing it, it will look different between us in our brain signatures and our brain patterns. And it can be recorded and then used to authenticate you when you want to unlock your device as a functional biometric. And what's nice about it, unlike a face print, is if it gets hacked or leaked or something like that, you'll just choose a different song, right? And you'll record a different functional biometric, and the way you solve a math problem, et cetera, are unique. But as I said, this more recent research comes out showing that it may be unique, but it's
We're
possible
not that unique after all.
Yeah, it may be possible to then figure out who that is across, training like one of these GPT-based models to translate across individuals. And so it's a convergence, right? When people say like, well, how is it possible for EEG to detect all of that? It's the rapid advances in AI that enable those signals to then be translated into and associated with what it is that you're thinking and feeling.
That's fascinating. And we'll talk about the speed of development coming up. Let's, before I start going into scary stuff, let's talk about the benefits of technology and why we would actually want to use that technology. Like all of us, so many of us are using those watches, smart watches, and we can't get enough of them. So tell us more about this technology and what it can help us with.
It's funny because I give a lot of talks on this book. And by the time I have finished describing to people the widespread neural interface that is coming, like most audiences they look kind of like crushed and uncomfortable and like, okay, fine, I'm just like checking out. And so I go exactly where you're going next, which is say, wait a minute, right? There are some serious benefits here. It's not just like Orwellian dystopia. And so it's good to recognize what some of those benefits are. The first and most important one, like let's forget the ease of interacting with other technology. The first and most important one is overall, our neurological health and well-being is getting worse over time, while the rest of our physical health is improving. And why is that? It's because we don't have good, first of all, data about a lot of the aging population and what happens to the aging brain and how you actually start to put into place measures to treat the 55 million people with dementia or the 50 to 60% of those people who have Alzheimer's disease, the more than 1 billion people worldwide who are suffering from mental health and drug use disorders, right? How do you start to develop the data that you need and the interventions you need? Well, you have to start by understanding the problem. And like most of the brain data that has been collected to date has been in limited laboratory settings. That's like a snapshot in time, as opposed to continuous monitoring of the brain in a natural environment over time. And the everyday integration of brain sensors into real life could actually allow the continuous monitoring of all kinds of health metrics, from the most serious to the everyday ones that we're grappling with, like stress, or I'm a chronic migrainer, right? Being able to have like real insights of this is what happens, in the day leading up to a migraine, or epileptic seizures, where continuous monitoring of brain data can allow people to get alerts minutes to up to an hour before they suffer from an epileptic seizure. And I could go on and on and on, right? I mean, neurological disease and well-being is probably the most important thing to our experience of being human. And it's the thing that we have had just the least luck in addressing. And it's not just luck, right? The least advances really in addressing. And this could really change that. Like if you look at the Apple Heart Health study that happened as a result of people's adoption of the watches, it's the largest wide-scale study to date that has led to real insights about things like atrial fibrillation and giving people alerts about when, they're suffering from a heart attack or high blood pressure or other significant events that can lead to interventions. Same thing could be true if we finally have these insights. And it's not just for disease, right? It's wellness, it's recreation, it's enhancement of the brain. It's, for most of us, we're living most of our lives distracted most of the time, right? If somebody's listening to a podcast right now, chances are they're also doing something like checking their phone, like taking the laundry out of the laundry machine.
I can tell it. I can see it.
Exactly. She can see, and you should just stop where you are and actually pay attention, right? But people are doing like 5 or 10 things at once, and they think they're doing them well, and they don't understand what the impact on their brain is, or the tax on their brain, or the cost of context switching, right? And you can see all of that with brain activity data. Like, I am not a good meditator of like close my eyes and have somebody do guided meditation, but I'm actually pretty good at doing meditation with neurofeedback devices that give me insight about, like where my brain activity is and how to have longer and more sustained periods of meditation. And there are all kinds of extraordinary health benefits that come from meditation. Real objective insights about what's happening in our brains is the key to unlocking so much of the upside potential. And then, of course, there's the coolness of like, we don't realize how awkward it is to use a keyboard and a mouse, right? Because we've like grown up using them. But it's actually like a really weird thing to have a mouse that you're using to navigate around the screen as opposed to just pointing where you want or like thinking like, I want to open my mailbox right now. And the ability to have that much more like frictionless interaction with technology could be really revolutionary for how like the capabilities that we have as humans, the capabilities and natural ease with which we interact with all of the rest of our technology. So those are just some of the upsides.
And you mentioned, controlling things with your thoughts. That it would really help disabled individials, for example, right? Who actually can't physically move the mouth.
Yeah.
Who can't physically open the mailbox.
And disabled and elderly and impacted and impaired in so many different ways, right? Like so much of user control and design is around a particular conception of your capabilities. And to really be able to interact without the kind of friction that a lot of us experience. My parents didn't grow up with technology. And so for them, the like trying to walk them through,
We've all been there.
We've all been there, right? And like, if they didn't have to go through all of that and they could just think, right, and navigate to the spaces they wanted to go through instead of like those painful conversations we have with our parents, like, no, double click. Double click means like faster than that, right? I mean, like, if we didn't have to do all of that and they could have more seamless interactions, it would be incredibly beneficial for this rapidly aging population as well. So yeah, I mean, the capacity to restore self-determination to a huge number of people in a world that is increasingly immersed with technology, it could be incredibly promising.
And there is another aspect that I'd like you to briefly talk about, and that's making dangerous jobs safer, right? I'm thinking about pilots, drivers, TSA, the folks who monitor flights and all that stuff.
Yeah. So, it's one of the first chapters in the book is called Your Brain at Work. And, I went into the chapter trying to kind of build an argument for what mental privacy should look like for individuals. And I really have come to believe that this is just so much more nuanced, right? That there are settings in which the use of neurotechnology in the workplace could be incredibly beneficial for workers and employers and society alike. And so an instance of that is like, there are so many different accidents that occur, like from commercial drivers, from mining accidents, even some, plane crashes over the past decade that are attributable to pilot fatigue and falling asleep at the wheel. And so there is the capacity to be able to track sleep and fatigue levels in the brain earlier than most driver assist technology does. Like if you think about when you're falling asleep at night, you're wide awake, you're getting more and more tired. There's like this period of time that like you think you're not quite sure if you're awake or asleep because you're kind of like lucid dreaming, right?
Right.
Well, that happens when people are falling asleep at the wheel too. And you can see those transitions in brain states earlier than when you lose control of the wheel or when you start to drive more erratically or you're nodding off a little bit. And that could lead to real-time alerts that are given both to the driver as well as to the employer in a limited number of settings. And this isn't hypothetical. Like there's actually companies out there that are selling these products like SmartCap that is sold into more than 5,000 companies worldwide that require their employees to wear different EEG sensors, whether they're in a hard hat or a baseball cap that picks up their fatigue levels. What I like about SmartCap is one of the things that's troubling, if you think about that, is how much information is going on in your mind at the same time as when you're tired. And if all of the rest of that information is being captured at the same time as your fatigue levels are. And what SmartCap does is they keep all of the neural data on device and they overwrite it continuously. And the only thing that ever leaves the device is an inference about your fatigue level from 1 to 5. And so it's a really narrow intrusion into mental privacy, right? And if you think about mental privacy as being a relative right to societal interest, like does a truck driver barreling down the highway really have a stronger right to mental privacy about their fatigue levels relative to societal interest in not having them crash a car? Probably not, right? So that's like a kind of safety metric. There are other ones where like a factory worker, especially in the era of automation, they're getting increasingly taxed with cognitive load and overload, right? The pace of work is kind of constantly increasing. And it turns out that cognitive overload creates most of the hazardous conditions in factories for individual factory workers. And that also can be measured. And automation can be calibrated in a responsive workplace where if a person is reaching levels of cognitive overload, you back off the pace in a way that actually says like, okay, like this person is about to, reach dangerous levels of stress. And so like, let's pull back to calibrate it. Again, the risk is like, is that used as a performance metric? Is it used as a surveillance tool versus is it something that's actually designed for safety? And it all depends on how it's implemented for how like good or bad it is. There's also like group level insights that have been developed, like Microsoft during the pandemic wanted to figure out why some people, like especially on Zoom calls back to back to back to back, were suffering from increasing stress. And they found part of it is because like in the Zoom-based environment or the, virtual environment, we tend to stack our meetings back to back to back to back without the same breaks we used to take, right? And you used to have like at least a 5-minute break between meetings where you'd walk from one meeting to the next. And that actually allowed your brain to reset. And so they found that both that was a problem. And so they changed the way they did scheduling based on brain data that showed the stress levels increasing as a result. But that also there was something about the virtual environment, like the misaligned gaze and the different backgrounds, like your brain has to do more work to process a lot of that information. And it's not as natural for us to be able to do so. And so that's why they introduce things like together mode, if you've ever tried that in, Teams to
right.
try to do, and it's a little cheesy. It's like you're in a giant amphitheater or something, right? But it's well-intentioned, which is to try to have design ways to address like the impact on your brain and using that data for improvements of the human condition and wellness rather than for like punitive or Orwellian and surveillance-based measures.
How widely spread are technologies like smart cap in the United States?
So it's hard to know exactly. It seems like it's less prevalent in the US than it is in other countries. Part of that is unionization, and a lot of the union contracts enable negotiation upfront of any adoption of new technology. But also part of it is like it has taken hold much more strongly across like Asia and Australia and other countries than it has as much here, at least as far as I've been able to, kind of discover and tell. What has happened much more prevalently here in the US than in other places is brain wellness programs within the workplace, which, seem great in that they're designed to try to decrease stress levels. The problem is in the US, there's sort of a regulatory gap when it comes to brain wellness programs because health information employees have stronger protections around, but a brain wellness program is not health information. And so to the extent that you are doing brain training games and other kinds of neurofeedback that an employer can use and have access to, and those are becoming increasingly more prevalent, there's a risk that that data could be misused by employers and it doesn't have the same kind of protection for employees in the workplace. So that's where, I see the kind of bigger uptake is in brain wellness within US-based companies and where I think neurotechnology devices are more likely to be adopted faster. Of course, all of these multifunctional devices that I was telling you about that are about to flood the marketplace, like first quarter of 2025, Meta has said they're going to launch their watch. There are rumors that Apple is going to have EEG in its AirPods. Their patent showed that they already have a patent for embedding a lot of EEG sensors into their AirPods. And when that happens, there will be much more readily accessible enterprise solutions that I think, are going to enter into a big regulatory gap where, given the huge amount of surveillance that's happening in the workplace, I think it's likely to become another and probably like the most pernicious form of employee surveillance that may happen.
Right. And that kind of transitions us nicely into the dangers associated with the technology.
Yeah.
Corporation. Let's talk about employers first and then transition to governments and the kind of advances that are happening too with, for example, military technology, and all those kinds of things.
Yeah. So, which one did you want to start with?
Let's start with employers really briefly, because there are all these great benefits to, monitoring their attention, but...
So, I mean, the most stark example of this that we have is in China, where factory workers and, train conductors are required to wear EEG sensors embedded in their conductor caps and hard hats that track their attention and even emotional levels throughout their workday, and that there are reports of employees being sent home as a result of, what their data shows and being, punished based on what their brain data reveals. It also just creates, I think, a very hostile environment. Like it's a panopticon when you have the asymmetry, the power asymmetry between employers and employees. And the one space of reprieve that we had, which was mental reprieve, right? The one space you talked about in your introduction of like the solace that you had is finally breached. And there's all kinds of metrics that can be used, like even looking for things like brain synchronization between employees who shouldn't have them, be able to detect like early stages of, organizing and unionization, or, how you react to a proposed raise, or, all kinds of things that you would otherwise want to keep private. Romantic, synchrony between some other employee in the workplace when there are policies against it. And in China, there are even reports of, I mentioned earlier that it's possible to probe a person's brain.
Right.
And the way that you might do that is you can show, like, if I were to flash something up on your computer screen and you have a brain sensor on, I could measure your response to it. And that in research settings has even been done to be able to like discover a person's PIN number based on recognition of numbers or their address where they live. And here it's been done for political messaging where, your reaction to, for example, communist messaging to see whether it's positive or negative in response to it, and then using that to, punish someone. And so those are some of the kind of workplace settings. There's also other companies outside of China. Like when I have presented on this information, I had a, CEO of a global company come up to me and say, like, we'd make a great use case for you because we've used these on thousands of employees across Asia where, it's helped us understand not just if they're paying attention or if their mind is wandering, but if they're bored or if they're engaged with their work. Like there are 10 different metrics that we've been measuring. We've made choices about whether to let people work from home or work on the office based on what their brain data reveals. So again, these aren't hypothetical, right? It's already happening.
That's something
and you could displace it to happen much more prevalently across the world, especially given that like more than 80% of companies say like we do surveillance of employees, right? Whether it's keystroke analysis or emails or productivity suite. This is kind of the ultimate metric that I think many of them may go after. So that's employers.
Right. And you started with China, and I think that's kind of a good transition also into Chinese government, for example. Yeah. And one of the stories you discuss in the book, it's actually a Wall Street Journal story from like 2019 or something, where in a public primary school, students were required to wear EEG devices. And the other thing that really shocked me is that they were supplied by a US manufacturer.
Yeah.
But so what were they?
I liked including that detail in it, right? Because people are like, oh, they're so terrible. And I'm like, and it was sold by a company that's based in Cambridge, Massachusetts. So just so like the next time you want to call out, another government, make sure you understand who's manufacturing it. So, government use of it can range from coercive use on citizens, right? Mm-hmm. And that's an instance where I really think of it as coercive use. Like if you, imagine a primary school setting where it's mandatory attendance, and then you're required to wear an EEG headset that tracks your attention and mind wandering. And that information is sent in real time to the teacher in the front of the classroom, is sent to the parents and to the state. Like, let's set aside whether it actually tells you anything. Like, even if it told you nothing at all, if you're a kid and you're being told that literally your brain activity is being monitored, right? You're going to imagine that everything that you're thinking and feeling is being monitored, right? And you're going to do as much as possible to try to, both like pay attention, but also to self-censor, right? Censor your very thoughts. Like it has such a chilling effect, I think, on on the population. Like there's all kinds of studies that show when people know that they're subject to surveillance, that the chilling effect that has, not just on who they're willing to talk with, but even censoring their own thoughts to try to conform, becomes really, really powerful. I've seen this, like when I've traveled to Iran and visited with my family there, their belief in the ubiquity of surveillance means like it doesn't matter if they're in their car or in a dark alley in the corner, they're afraid to speak out loud because they're convinced they're always being listened to, right? And that's the kind of thing that I think you can expect with surveillance when the government uses it in a coercive and mandatory way. But it's not just in that context. I mean, China has made clear that they consider the brain the sixth domain of warfare. It's called cognitive warfare. And there are all kinds of, military documents that are out there, and NATO has written extensive reports on this that show, in part, it's like informational warfare. It's part of the reason why the U.S. government is so worried about platforms like TikTok, right, which are owned by a foreign government. But it's not just informational warfare. It's also collecting biometric information on foreign citizens and then using that to profile and understand and figure out how you can instrument them. And then on top of that, this worry that they may be developing weapons that could target to disorient and disable the brain. There is, a set of U.S. Diplomats who in different embassies, have claimed to suffer from something that's now called Havana syndrome, which is, a similar set of symptoms around, ringing in the ears and headaches. And, it's been like super murky as to exactly what's happening. When the National Academies of Science looked into it, they thought that there was a foreign adversary behind it and that a microwave weapon or radio frequency was being targeted at them. The U.S. intelligence agency, when they came out in a joint statement, they said they didn't think that a foreign adversary was behind it. There was a recent 60 Minutes episode, which did a deep investigative dive, which starts to point to maybe Russia being involved in it. And then, the Biden administration has sanctioned 4 Chinese firms for the development of purported brain control weaponry. So, I think like we should be on high alert of governments trying to develop weapons and maybe successfully doing so that try to disable and disorient people's brains, whether that's through cognitive warfare on a platform or through devices that are actually targeted at our brains and that seek to disrupt and disorient us.
Yes, when I first heard about the Havana syndrome in the news, when you first, had the Cuban diplomats talking about it, not knowing that much about the subject, it just sounded crazy to me. But as I'm reading your book, I'm thinking, oh my God, these people make a complete sense.
Yeah, I mean, and I who knows still, right? Exactly.
Right.
If like Havana syndrome is or is not real, because there's also, this theory of mass psychogenic illness.
Right.
But what's clear is there is an intent to develop these weapons, right? And if we want to be thinking about what the laws are and what the rights are and what the rules of warfare are, we need to pay attention to the intentional development of weapons that are targeted at the brain.
Yes, and I kind of want to transition to the law framework. I want to pause for 1 second on something that you mentioned earlier, and this idea of the conformity of thought. You quote John Stuart Mill on liberty in the book, kind of talking about the importance of, people thinking individually and listening to others and understanding what their thought process is. And I think that's a fascinating downside of governments being able to read your thought, that self-censorship in thought. So Can you just pause on that a little bit more? Because I think our listeners will really like to hear it.
Yeah. So, most people at this point are very familiar with cancel culture, right, in general, and the effects that that's had on people feeling like they can speak freely in different contexts. And it's had some positive effects, and that people have been held accountable for, things that they have said and done. And it's also had some negative effects in that it has chilled a lot of speech that might have been quite innocent and appropriate speech, but that people are afraid will be misused against them, or that could lead to their cancellation more generally and have severe economic and career and otherwise impacts on their life. Now, if you imagine the number of thoughts that you have per day, most of them you filter, right? I mean, the example I like to give is, You arrive at your friend's house, they have a brand new couch. It's like bright orange, right? And like your first thought is like, wow, right? I mean, like, what were you thinking, right? But you don't tell them that. You're like, oh, I just saw this great article in the Washington Post about like an unexpected red, and this is like unexpected orange, and go you're so on trend, right? I mean, you come up with something, right? We do this a million times a day, right? As part of how we interact with other people. We also decide what we're going to share with other people and what we're not just because we think their couch is ugly, but part of how we define the intimacy of our relationship with each other is by what we choose to share with other people and who we choose to share it with, who we entrust with like the innermost thoughts that we have. If you spend your life afraid that your brain will reveal things about you, right, that you don't intend to share, the effect of it is a profound chilling on what people think and self-censorship. Every time your mind starts to wander or fantasize about who you are or your gender identity or, some crazy dream about, rising up against a tyrannical government, right? You're going to suppress all of that because the more actively you can suppress it, the less likely you are to be punished for your thoughts. Now, you can't do that all the time, and some people will just end up punished for their thoughts in a setting like that. And there are, complications of different layers of thought. Like, imagine that you grew up with a particular prejudice. Your family was quite, racist or prejudiced in some particular way. You recognize that in yourself, you hate it in yourself, and you've been working your entire life to overcome it, right? If I show you an image of whoever you have a prejudice against, your brain might automatically react to that image negatively. And then your higher level, metacognition kicks in and is like, bad you, don't do that, right? Remember, this is not who you are. But that part might be revealed, the automatic negative reaction, and maybe you'll be branded and labeled as being somebody who is prejudiced in some particular way, even though you've spent your life overcoming it because of things that you were conditioned or exposed to as a child. And so, it's like so profound as you start to think about the layers of self-censorship that you would have to engage in a world of brain transparency where you don't have rights and freedoms over the like internal state of your mind and experiences.
Yes. And also I'm thinking about parents, right? Raising children in these kinds of environments where you basically lie to your child. You just try to condition them to believe, all the good things about everything surrounding them and how they should be, their heart should be swelling with joy when they're listening to the dear leader. And that really has generational problems too.
Yep, I agree.
Yeah. But so going into this kind of thank God we live in a country where we actually have laws. And we can think of the best ways to safeguard against abuses. So let's start with, first of all, what's already there in terms of, guarantees for the freedom of thought as part of the First Amendment or Fourth Amendment protections or Fifth Amendment protections. What's already there that could potentially be applied, but also why is it that what's already there not quite enough to cover this?
So maybe freedom of thought is included within freedom of speech, but freedom of speech has almost always been described as being about expression, right? And like reducing it to language or expression rather than what's in your mind. There's some dicta in some cases that talk about freedom of thought being the precursor to freedom of speech, but it's never been explicitly challenged or recognized. And it's unclear, even if there was freedom of thought, how broad that would be or what it would protect. Is it all of your thoughts, right? There's no comprehensive privacy policy. And so to think that there's also mental privacy, when there is no comprehensive privacy policy means that that doesn't exist. But in different states, it's undoubtedly the case that in the states that have comprehensive privacy policies, that if challenged, your neural data would be considered sensitive data. And so I think in those jurisdictions, there's likely to be some protections that are afforded. There may be some context-specific protections like unreasonable search and seizure under the Fourth Amendment. Perhaps seizing brain activity would fall under the unreasonable side of search and seizure, what that would require then would be a warrant. Maybe the privilege against self-incrimination would at least protect you of some context of interrogating the brain. But again, it's never been challenged, and it's a little bit blurry because there's other physical evidence from the body that can be required, including things like a voice exemplar or handwriting samples, like functional things that you have to do. And it could be that brain activity is treated like something from your body rather than testimonial evidence. And so what I'd say is like, there are some things that creative lawyers can and should use if, this kind of information is taken. Within the employment setting in the US, there are not robust worker protection laws against surveillance. In fact, most of the surveillance laws have gone in favor of the employers rather than employees. But there are some biometric protection laws. And those biometric protection laws largely require notice and disclosure and purpose and use limitation by employers who use biometric data. Mostly that's been interpreted for identification purposes. So the brain-based biometrics we were talking about earlier would probably be covered under those state laws. And there's a shift toward trying to recognize that biometrics could be used for far more than identity to make inferences about brain and mental experiences. And some of those biometric laws and the FTC's approach to this has a broader interpretation of biometric laws to be about inferences as well. So it could be that there's some traction under biometrics laws. In Colorado recently, there was a category of biological data that was recently protected under the Colorado Privacy Act, which specifies neural data used for identification purposes is also covered. So that's another biometric identification law that, again, is specific to identification, but specifies neural data. And then in California, there's a law pending, a proposed law that would expand the categories of sensitive data to include neural data. And that's broader because right now it doesn't specify for identification purposes. And so that would more broadly protect the processing and use and third-party use of that data under the heightened protections that are given to sensitive data under California's privacy law. So there's some laws, right?
Right.
There's also some big gaps. Ed tech in educational settings has largely not been protected. There's some anti-discrimination laws, and Fed protection of civil rights that could come into play if people are discriminated against based on neuroatypicality or neurodivergence that might emerge from how these are used. But what I see is that there's not a comprehensive approach to protecting the set of interests that really would be implicated on freedom of thought and mental privacy and self-determination. So I've been advocating for a broader approach that would recognize a right to cognitive liberty, which is a right to self-determination over our brain and mental experiences, which would direct us to recognizing both a right to mental privacy, both in terms of international human rights law, but that would apply domestically in the United States as well, a more robust right to freedom of thought that would protect against interpretation and manipulation and punishment for thoughts. And then a right to self-determination because, we've been talking about decoding, but not much about neural modulation. And a lot of this is like read-write capability. So the capability of being able to stimulate and change the brain. And that's already happening with recommender algorithms that are steering you in different ways on social media, but it could happen much more precisely with different kinds of neurostimulation devices that could be coercively used in different settings.
So it's the neuromarketing thing?
Neuromarketing is part of it, right? But it's also much more direct neurostimulation. Like if you take the law enforcement context, people talk about like neurorehabilitation. If you think about chemical castration, that's a form of trying to like change a person's brain to, make them less likely to act on pedophilia. And if you could morally enhance a prisoner or, change their brain activity, it's a kind of thing that people talk about. And you like can be sure that some kind of brainwashing or attempts at brainwashing are the kinds of things that people will attempt unless there are safeguards against it. And so, that's a kind of a principled level of we need a right to mental privacy, we need a right to freedom of thought, and we need a right to self-determination. And then we need context-specific laws that address that, right? So we need broader privacy protection laws that address the data, which is how it's most likely to be misused. We need employment-specific and, children and youth and, education settings. We need specific safeguards against, neuromarketing or marketing to you while you're asleep, for example, and the most vulnerable. And so there are context-specific applications of those broader rights that need to also be enacted to really address the different ways in which the data could be misused or the technologies could be misused against individuals.
Yes, and I'm thinking too about some of the examples in your book involving criminal laws and protections for criminal defendants, right? And you're talking about, actually, it's not in the United States, but like United Arab Emirates, for example, is already using this neuro data in order to like convict people of murder, for example.
Yeah, it's been happening quite prevalently in India for a while now. And in other settings like UAE and Singapore and a few other places, there have been discussions of it. Again, oftentimes US-based technology that's being exported to different countries, right? But the idea is this like neural interrogation where the brain recognizes crime scene details, right? And is able to do so like, sub-behaviorally, pre-behaviorally. So it doesn't require you to say, yes, I recognize that. It's looking for automatic reactions in the brain to recognition of crime scene details that you shouldn't know unless you were somehow involved.
Right.
And, that kind of like interrogating the brain, it's interesting because some people are like, well, it's better than torturing someone. Okay. Like that's not a good argument from my perspective, but, but it's also like it's coercive interrogation and it's turning a person's body against themselves. It kind of strikes at fundamental dignitary rights of what it means to be human. And so, across these contexts, whether it's law enforcement or employment or, government weapons that are developed, we need to, go back to what we were talking about earlier, which is there's huge upside potential if we direct this technology and put the appropriate safeguards in place so that what we realize is the happy utopian version of this, right? The neurological flourishing version of this, where it's used to like help our brain health and reverse neurological disease and suffering. Not the like Orwellian dystopian version of it, where we're starting to see glimmers of that already happening. And you can be sure that that will happen at scale unless we actually try to put into place the appropriate safeguards against it.
Yeah, and I'm thinking back to, after the 9/11, right, when the United States started to fund like brain fingerprinting technologies and all that kind of stuff. So this idea that, it's not going to happen here. But like you said, a lot of this technology we're actually exporting to other countries. Yeah. And we also, the United States government itself, spent a significant amount of time researching and developing all this stuff.
For sure. And a lot of the funding comes from the State Department and the Department of Defense and the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency. And, you can be sure that we are investing in all of this. And it's not just to safeguard against, coercive use by other countries and other governments. And so, like the government is also putting a tremendous amount of funding into neurological health and well-being and to trying to identify the neural correlates of different diseases. And, it's like any government. They are investing heavily in military and they're investing heavily in health. And what we want to make sure is that the applications that we as humanity benefit from and are able to enjoy are the ones that are really aligned with human health and well-being, not the ones that coercively take from us the last bastion of freedom and privacy that we have.
So how do we do that? So to our listeners, right? Yeah. If we're thinking about this intersection of law and technology and things to come, what is it that we can do going forward to ensure that this does not get out of control?
So, first and foremost, I think it's to understand this isn't isolated just to neurotechnology. And I say that to say, like, if you look at the way that biometrics, like facial emotion recognition, approaches or trying to make inferences from algorithmic interpretations of all of the personal data that you have, that's being triangulated from your interaction with every technology that's out there, there is a massive battle underway for our brains and self-determination over our brain and mental experiences. And if we carve out one technology, it's going to be like whack-a-mole, right? Mm-hmm. We need to actually take a holistic approach to technologies and to recognize like there is a normative core here of things that we're trying to safeguard. And so as lawyers, I think don't rush to legislate on a technology, rush to understand the interconnections between the technologies and the common threats to the basic core values of human rights and human dignity that they pose, and then advocate for holistic change that actually addresses that. And then push as lawyers to explore these dimensions, right? We talked about First Amendment law.
Right.
Try out a challenge using First Amendment law saying it should include like freedom of thought, right? Push at the margins to try to more robustly have our existing laws be able to address modern threats to basic human dignity and to basic core conceptions of the rights that we all, should have and deserve.
Right.
We didn't have to make explicit any of these rights before, but that doesn't mean we implicitly can't find them in most of our existing rights if we recognize that, we didn't have to say that freedom of speech included freedom of thought because it was just assumed that you could never get at freedom of thought, right? But obviously, you can't have freedom of speech if you can't have freedom of thought, right? And so push at the margins and be the innovators that actually broaden to not have to legislate every time some new technology comes down the pike, but to say there are core values that underlie our existing rights, and we should enforce those to more broadly address the changes that are occurring as well. And be vigorous advocates for policy change, for rights, that actually address this core set of concerns. And when you see things like the Kids Online Safety Act or other provisions that seek to put into place safeguards for more vulnerable populations and groups, come out in favor and in support of those in order to ensure that the most vulnerable in society have a cognitive future that is secure for them to be able to flourish.
And you mentioned First Amendment. You also write about the Fifth Amendment distinction between testimonial and physical dichotomy, for example, right? And it really seems like that also is an area that for lawyers to push on. Yeah,
especially for criminal defendants, right?
Right.
I mean, so Fourth and Fifth Amendment rights, I would think, I wrote about this both in my book, but also, longer law review articles that do a deep dive into this and say, look, if we were to take it literally at face value, the Fourth Amendment, as it's been interpreted in the Fifth Amendment, as it's been interpreted, might not cover brain data, but it should, right? In the same way that freedom of thought should be included within freedom of speech, the right against self-incrimination should include, interrogating your brain and having it respond silently, but through blood flow rather than through words. If we look at what the purpose of these things are, just because there is some novel way to get around it doesn't mean that we should. And so we as lawyers should push against that and to make sure that if a criminal defendant is subject to interrogation, of brain-based interrogation, that we hold the line to ensure that there isn't rights erosion as a result of the adoption of novel technologies.
Yeah, that really makes me think back to the Brandeis article from 1890s, where he really was, maybe he was thinking about specific things he was foreseeing in the future, but this right to privacy idea is really, for generations and hundreds of years to come.
Definitely. Yeah.
Well, on that note, I'm going to ask you one last question.
Okay.
And that's whether you wrote your book using the Pomodoro method.
Definitely. So, by the time I finally got to serious writing of the book, I had an infant and a young child at home, and they are not ones to give me, unended amounts of time with giant vats of hummus that I can hang out in my PJs and write. So instead, they got used to waiting for the timer, and I'd be like, nope, the timer hasn't gone up. I've got 25 minutes to write here. You got to not distract mommy until the timer goes off. And so, I got good at writing in the Pomodoro method, which used to be impossible for me because I'd be like, I need at least 25 minutes to even get into writing before, and I was like, nope, as soon as I sit down, I got to dive right in. You can't use any of the procrastination techniques if you have kids and a limited amount of time and focus to write.
But you can do a lot of things in 25 minutes.
You can do a lot of things in 25 minutes. And especially if you sometimes get 25 minutes that are strung back to back with just 5-minute breaks in between, then you can do pretty well.
That's very inspiring. I'm going to try to adopt that method myself.
Excellent.
Well, thank you so much for coming on the show and for talking about this. This is a really, really important topic. And I hope that 20 years from now, when we look back to this time, we think, yes, we were on top of this and we did the things that we should have done.
I hope so. Very much so. Thank you. Thanks for your time and for your great questions.